Thank you for joining us on In Tune to Nature, and this is a combined show with my sister show and co-host Melody Paris, who does the Second Opinion Radio Animal Rights Show. Also with me, we alternate Wednesday nights on WRFG, Radio Free Georgia. I usually do the second and fourth Wednesday, and she does the first and third Wednesdays. But we joined together on November 19th, 2025, to talk about a presentation I recently gave called Unwilling, Unconsenting, and Unnecessary Research Subjects, Addressing Anthropocentric Bias in Journalistic Coverage, Legitimizing the Abuse of Other Animals in Research. And so you'll hear me talking at the beginning of the show as Melody comes in. So also this is a live show that I'm going to be playing for you. Normally I pre-record a lot of the In Tune to Nature shows, so they sound a little bit smoother than this. And you'll see I was a little flustered at the beginning because I was expecting to just kind of waltz in and Melody was going to run the show, and then because the Second Opinion radio show is really hers, and I was just going to kind of sit back and be interviewed about this topic, this journalism topic. But then she unfortunately got stuck in Atlanta traffic, and that's a difficult thing, trying to commute to the station. So then I just kind of had to get up there and start running the boards, at, knowing she was coming, but not knowing exactly when. So I'm a little flustered to start out. But I wanted to also mention that we're going to be talking about non-human animal research on other species besides humans for the most part, and critiquing that in terms of how journalism is one of the institutions that needs to move forward to help us transition away from this largely ineffective and definitely unethical practice, sometimes called vivisection. But I also just want to acknowledge that human beings have also been, and may still be, even illegally, used as unwilling, unconsenting, and uninformed research subjects. And that's particularly been the case with vulnerable beings and marginalized groups throughout history. But we've definitely changed the laws related to researching on humans, and we really haven't changed the laws related to researching on other living beings who are our kin, other animal species. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Thanks for hanging out with us. And welcome to WRFG Atlanta. This is an In Tune to Nature show, but really it's a Second Opinion radio show. I accidentally played my In Tune to Nature intro instead of the Second Opinion intro, and Melody is I think she's just about to step in the station here. She just commuted in from work. I'm able to walk over because I live close to the station. But it's a little harder for her to get to the station based on where she works and lives these days, but she's about to join us. And she is going to be interviewing me related to a recent presentation that I gave to a Swiss group that's called Animal Free Research Foundation, and they wanted me to talk about journalism in terms of what role does journalism play in legitimizing animal research, and how could we address the anthropocentric bias in journalistic coverage that legitimizes the use of other animals in research. And so I was just telling Melody, why don't you interview me about that? Because before I forget, since I just did this remotely, I didn't get to go to Switzerland, unfortunately, but I did the remote talk. But the topic of vivisection seems really useful for the Second Opinion radio show. And so that's why I was like, oh, let's do that. And so Melody's just let me turn her mic on here. She's just joining us.
Hi, Carrie.
Hey, I hope you must be stressed from commuting in Atlanta traffic to get here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you made it okay. I didn't want you, rushing or anything like that.
Yeah,
so.
It's a little crazy out there. I think that we're getting closer here in Atlanta to, holidays. And so people are, saving up their time. They're all at work right now because they're going to take time off later. Oh. So that's my theory. But they're all driving like lunatic. So
Yeah.
there you have it. But
There was you driving sanely, and then everyone else.
that is correct.
Yeah, you hear that, everyone else? Except for our listeners, of course.
That's
Yes.
right. But yeah, I so fascinated by your presentation. Wish I could have heard it live. It's such an important topic. So happy to talk about it tonight.
Oh, yeah.
And-
Like some of the things that we can talk about that I was covering in the presentation for the Animal Free Research Foundation was, okay, what are the problems or the root causes of our news coverage of that really kind of favors the anthropocentric or human-centered status quo? So what are some of those solutions from the animalsandmedia.org guidelines that Dr. Deborah Merskin and I put forth? And then Melody, you and I could talk about some of the news coverage that we've seen. We've probably been watching the news related to animal rights for like 30 years, wouldn't you say?
Yep.
Since the 90s, we both have been doing this. And so just even with that, we have some experience to talk about what are the common times we see animal research brought up in the news. I just heard it, some Ozempic oriented or just like weight loss drug research just today done on mice. So we can talk about what we usually see and what could be different about that coverage that would be fairer to other animals. So those are kind of the main things that we're going to cover today.
Yeah, I think just, talking about why you, from your perspective specifically, because you're an expert on this, the mainstream journalism tends to really legitimize, animal research instead of questioning it is really a good thing to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that journalists they wouldn't want us to do a show that was just like, oh, how can journalism promote animal-free research? Because the word promote would sound uncomfortable to them. Mm-hmm. But I think what it's better to do is to interrogate the fact that they have a bias towards the status quo, and that status quo use of other animals is unethical and it's largely ineffective. I mean, I won't say that it always is ineffective, but it's not the most effective way to do things, and it's unethical. So I don't think it's not a win-win situation. So I think that journalism just also needs to come on board in helping us question or have a better discussion about something that should be seen as controversial and not just like ho-hum.
Well, yeah, I agree. I would add to that. I think at this point and where we are so far as in terms of animal research, there's so much more evidence there that shows that it's not effective, but that stuff is largely ignored. Right? It's not even balanced. I mean, it's really the scales have tipped in the favor of, alternatives to animal research. But the media has to, in my opinion, but of course, like I said, you're the expert on that, is still kind of stuck in the old ways of reporting. They haven't come forward, and there's so much more evidence, and maybe because people are thinking about it and because of 30 years of people protesting and really pushing this forward, but it's largely ignored.
Yeah, I think the main, and we can talk more about this, but the main times you hear animal research mentioned is when they're just saying, like I heard today about the weight loss drugs, oh, they found XYZ in mice related to nausea or related to thirst and da-da-da. And so like this might relate to humans once we kind of get around to studying on consenting, willing humans. And in the meantime, they're studying on unconsenting, uninformed mice. But they didn't mention anything about what are some of the downsides of using mice, or that this might not work. It might not lead to anything with humans, and there's ethical issues with even doing this, and the mice end up probably getting killed and different things. So also somebody at the conference when I was presenting, he said that he thought that there should be, in every news story, they should cover the costs of that animal research. And it could be costs related to the lives involved, the number of individual mice that are being involved, and like the cost, it could be to taxpayers or however they get the funding, just so that we also have that context for this. not that I want everybody to constantly question every type of scientific research, whether it's justified or not, because I know we don't all know the value sometimes of things if we're not scientists. But still, I thought that was an interesting kind of factual context that you could give. And I think it would be interesting to know how many mice or other animals are being used for this research. Yeah, so that's like just an example of how if there was a bit of a critical perspective put on this, that could be added to the discussion. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think the count or the what people estimate is around 110 million animals just in the U.S. every year die and suffer, through that. But I think even more fascinating, like I said, I think that, over time it's been shown that 95% of all new drugs that test safe and effective in animal tests, non-human animals, fail in human clinical trials.
What was the percentage that you had there?
95%.
Ooh, right.
Right. So mostly because they don't work or they actually turn out to be dangerous. And if you watch TV at certain times, and I don't know how what audience they're targeting, but you'll see ad after ad after ad saying there's a class action suit of this drug or that drug that, if you start to think about that and think about, well, if 95% of all these drugs, that test safe in non-human animals then end up being given to humans, well, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not mice. And, but, it becomes like, I think there's, just from what I've noticed, there's a lot of aspects to that. There's the, of course, the legality. We live in a litigious world, so they're kind of hedging their bets on that by saying, well, it was tested on animals.
Right. Like that's a good point. That I'm interrupting you now, but I was reminding me, there was a lady at the conference, a doctor, I think she was a medical doctor, Dr. Krebs from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And she was critiquing how the editors and of all the journals, the scientific journals, often they just kind of go with this old school.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, you did a study. Oh, that's interesting. Why? But you didn't do it in other animals or mice or whoever. Add that and we'll publish it. So then they force what could be young academics and stuff to do things that they might not even realize. They might think is actually not useful, but then they get kind of forced by the establishment to do it anyway. And so we just might be used to this. And so I think maybe it takes a newer generation of minds to say this doesn't have to be the way. And it's not always validated in different species, because how many different species could you try something on? When if the species who's going to be using the drugs, or sometimes they're studying addiction and all kinds of things, related to humans, well, we're all very complicated, and sometimes even something that would work for you, Melody, as a human might not even work for me as a human. So it's so complicated that also you introduce other species that could kind of send you in the wrong direction.
It actually does send in the wrong direction, and I mean, it delays actual progress. I mean, because, okay, so it works in a mouse, but then you have to eventually give it to a human anyway to see if it works in a human. And how does that translate? Well, as we see, most of the time it doesn't. 95% of the drugs, it doesn't. So it's dangerous. And the thing is, now there's so many different alternatives that it's not really even necessary. So I said, I think to your point and to mine, I think the media just, they're not scientists. We don't expect them to be, but they're dealing with the way things always have been, the establishment, that sort of thing. So getting the word out and making it easy for them to understand, I think is the key. Yeah.
And having them cover these new alternatives more, and having, so maybe these, what we would call anti-vivisection group, I noticed that they don't tend to use that term anymore. Maybe it's just an old-fashioned term, the cutting into life, but because the anti-vivisection, anti-animal research movement, it has been around since at least the 1800s. And so it's actually a very long-term animal rights and animal welfare movement. But now I noticed they're using the terms like animal research alternatives or better alternatives or animal-free research. So they're focusing more on the not so much why not to, but like what else is there. And like, so I think that you're seeing a lot of that. So that could be reported in the technology and the medical news more often. And then the more journalists are aware of it, the more when they hear a traditional study just using mice or rabbits or something, that they might kind of question. That could be one of the questions. What other ways could you have done this? You know, like, besides killing animals, what was the alternative? And then like put them on the spot and say, oh.
Yeah, right. I mean, there has been, I was reading just recently, there's been some good news. And I did not know this because it wasn't in the news. So to our point, but I guess just this year in the summer, there was a joint like NIH and FDA webinar, and it was decided that NIH will no longer release funding opportunities that call only for experiments on animals. So this is something PETA's been pushing for.
Great.
You know, they've kind of redirected and are really focusing a lot of efforts on animal research now as one of their main tenets. So now all future NIH grant announcements will also encourage the use of human relevant non-animal methods. So I think we're starting to see steps in the right direction, you know?
Right. So if those systems were put in place, in this case with the grant opportunities, because that really drives a lot of what gets studied in the first place, and then what gets published and the knowledge that gets out there is those editors at the journals and the peer reviewers. That's another system that needs to wake up to this. And then journalism is one of those pieces too. And then how do you report on this in a way that would facilitate more grant money and more support for these other things, or society just questioning?
Right.
Because I think so, as long as society tends to think, oh, well, we need this, it's kind of like a necessary evil or something, like, I don't like that they have to die, but if it's for us, blah, blah, blah. That kind of attitude, I mean, I never thought that was right anyway from an ethical perspective, but it's also not even right because this isn't the way we need to be doing things, and it's not the best way. It's not as effective. And so now we don't need to. I think that we can get past some of that cognitive dissonance that people have to kind of open up to the idea that we shouldn't be testing on animals. I think sometimes because of our speciesist bias, our bias towards humans, our belief that humans are more important than other animals, that's one of the main barriers to the kind of quality reporting that we're talking about, is because there's not a large public demand, like from your everyday American, that is questioning animal research or pushing the journalists to do something different. Because if the journalists aren't seeing a groundswell of change, then they're not going to lead that change. And so, and that's what we do in the animal rights movement and in critical animal studies and in academia, is try to raise awareness of the fact that this bias we have against other animals, this human privilege, this human exceptionalism, is not the right story to tell about ourselves. And it sets everything up for us to do things wrong and for us to exploit. And that's the root cause of so many environmental problems and just all the animal exploitation that we have, and factory farming and everything comes out of that. And along with that, the bias towards humans, I think also just the fact that we're used to, the norm is that we're self-centered. And okay, you could say, like, those of us, like, you study marketing, you know, and I study communications, we work in this area. And yeah, humans talk to humans about other humans all the time. You know, it's like, okay, so, you know, some of that makes sense. All right. And, but that we live on a planet with like trillions of other individuals and at least millions of other species groups. And we rarely even talk about them. Like, so that's the other thing that journalists are up against, that so long as a lot of the human news consuming public is fine just listening to us talk about ourselves and, you know, studies that help us, that even if they hurt other animals, like you don't really care because you're just focused on what's going to benefit us. So long as that's the norm and we don't question that norm and we're not more biocentric, like life-centric, and we don't start questioning, how is this affecting all these other beings we share the planet with? If we don't start opening up to that, then again, journalism is not asked to do that either. Mm-hmm. And it cannot just continue to be the animal rights movement that asks journalists to do this. We're not a large enough movement in terms of the activists. I mean, honestly, activists in any group are never large enough. You need the whole public to come along and to make any real change. The activists like us, we're trying to generate the excitement from you, our listeners. If this resonates with you, that, maybe you'll be kind of part of the larger movement in changing social norms.
Because the way, every single day when I'm on my phone looking at the news app or whatever, there's always a catchy headline that, promises or puts hope out there that researchers are on the verge of curing Alzheimer's. Oh, we're on the verge of curing this or curing that, or there's a breakthrough. When you click on it, it's always like, well, they're testing or they're on the verge. It's always on the verge. Sometimes they do mention, and very often they will mention that once you click on it and go to it, it'll say yes, and it's showing promising results in, studies in mice or this or that. So they will mention that. And I think people are just kind of, they're immediately envisioning themselves or someone they love who has that issue. Yeah, and they're like, well, I mean, I'm willing to let animals be researched on if it's going to save the person I love or save my child. And ever since I started this, it's always been that pull, like it's my baby or the mouse, or the loved one or the mouse. Which I guess, of course you can understand that thought process, but the truth is it, actually what it does is delay progress. Mm-hmm. So if we really want to help the people we love, then, moving towards these alternatives that are more effective is the right thing to do. But they get us with that. They get people with that hook. Yeah. But so I think it still comes back to education, for the public and for the media. And particularly the media, because they're the ones pushing it out there, that it's not an either-or situation.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
And, I mean, also, you can take that to an extreme and say that we might even, or people in general, might be willing to let other people suffer through experimentation to save their own loved ones. Now, it's easier when it's another species to say, oh, okay, and it's legal, like, oh, okay. But, there has been a history of using humans, unwilling, uninformed humans, who are in vulnerable positions as research subjects. And that might be more effective, but it's certainly not ethical.
Right.
So we can't always just be thinking about ourselves and our loved ones. We need to be thinking about the right means to an end. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've finally gotten to a place in science where we're using the right means to an end when it comes to humans, that especially in the rules that came out after the Holocaust, we have much stricter rules related to human subjects. And so if you want to do any research on humans, it has to go through this IRB, Institutional Research Board process. It's like really strict, and we're talking about we're not just talking about medical, we're talking about me, and I study the media. I can't even interview people for my book without making sure that I have university approval, and it's like really tedious and go through a lot of loops and jump through a lot of hoops. Then you have to have this big document that explains all the benefits and risks and how they can get out of it if they don't want to participate and all the rights they have. And then a lot of times they have to sign it, or they have to at least acknowledge that they read it, so that they're fully informed before they agree. So it's not, when I write a book, it's not the same as me just being a journalist and saying, hey, do you want to be in my book? Let me ask you some questions. So, and while I'm impressed with the level of rigor that even I have to go through as a non-medical researcher to the safeguards put in place for humans, it's just, they're so out of whack with the fact that if I put on a white coat, if I was a scientific researcher in academia, I could kill hundreds or thousands of unwilling, uninformed individuals because they weren't human. Because they're mice or fruit flies or fish or something.
Or cats or
dogs
or other
or primates.
Primates.
So that does not sit well with me. And so that's why I constantly use, because the term for ethical research in the science and medical and scholarly arena is that people have to be informed and give consent, and then it's ethical to research on them. That's the language I like to use related to any other sentient being, that if they cannot be informed, which we really don't have good enough communication skills with other species for them to be informed. So that's just not even possible. And then, so that's the basis of consent. Like, you can't consent until you're informed. Well, they can't even be informed, so they can't consent. And even if they could consent, because it seemed like you gave them an experimental drug coated in some kind of candy they liked, they still are uninformed. So anyway, I like to use to say that other animals are like unconsenting, uninformed, because that points out that what we're doing is unethical according to IRB standards. It just hasn't been made illegal yet in these other species. But that's just us as humans being selfish and just deciding like, oh, they can be sacrificed, but we can't. So first of all, that's unethical. And then as we talked about, it also doesn't even make sense. It's not always going to work in other humans. And so then you're a lot of times just wasting lives and causing all kinds of suffering and wasting money. And then further perpetuating this idea that we're so much more important. Like, the more industries find different ways, the food industry, the entertainment industry, the research industry, the more they all kind of collude in this idea that it's okay to exploit other animals, they bolster each other. Mm-hmm. So that's why I feel like even stopping eating animals and producing animals on farms is part of the way we stop researching on them, and vice versa. Like, that all of these things, well, if we're consuming animals every day, we certainly should use an animal to save my child's life or research,
Mm-hmm.
So, but we really don't need to be doing any of these things, and we'd be a much better society if we weren't justifying all this kind of exploitation against individuals who they don't have any means of protecting themselves legally from this assault on them.
Yeah. And right. And it is an assault, and it is kept very behind the scenes so that people don't see it. I believe the last I don't know when this was done, but it was a survey of people who, it was like 52%. It was more than half the people are against animals being researched on. Oh. And I think that, even the people who said they are for it are, in that mindset of it's going to save our lives. Back to being selfish, right?
Right.
But you get the thought process, and they really don't understand that actually doing the right thing, in almost every case that you mentioned, doing the right thing, the ethical thing, actually benefits us. When we don't eat farm animals and eat them and do all the things, the horrible things to them, then we don't have to deal with many of the diseases that it causes, right?
Yeah, and all the pollution and
all
the water contamination, yeah.
Right? And then, using animals for vivisection, we're actually diverting funding and time and effort and brain power away from actually finding cures for humans. So, doing the right thing actually helps us. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a win-win situation, mm-hmm. and that's a good way to put it. Before we take a break, I also wanted to say another thing that's working against, besides all the speciesism and the human selfishness, another thing that works against journalists kind of critiquing the status quo is that most journalism they're part of a big for-profit media enterprise. And so I'm not saying that the news outlets themselves don't want to maintain journalistic standards, but they're under a lot of economic pressure, and the incentive structure of their corporate leaders is not set up. It's a conflict of interest to their notion of independent journalism. And so that doesn't work that well. And then now in the United States, we have a lot of political pressure from the Trump administration on the media corporations that then put pressure on their news outlets to kind of go with the agenda. And there's not an agenda that is usually like, oh, let's stop, exploiting animals. So anyway, I just want to kind of mention that, and the fact that we humans are the journalists are humans and the news consumers are humans. And so there's just kind of those pressures until there's more of an economic demand from the news consumers for this kind of change. I don't think journalists might do it on their own. Although when we come back from this break, I think we can talk about some of the journalistic reasons they really should do it, maybe even without that public pressure, that'll happen. And we are back on Second Opinion Radio on WRFG Radio Free Georgia. This is Carrie Freeman and Melody Paris. And today we are talking about journalism's role in trying to bring about a change towards an animal-free research environment where we're actually promoting ethical, effective research for all kinds of purposes that can help society and other animals as well. And this was based on a talk that I recently gave to this animal-free research foundation in Switzerland. And so I wanted to also just share it, with you all. And part of it, Melody, was me going through those animalsandmedia.org guidelines for journalists that Dr. Merskin and I put together. And I picked out the ones that relate the most to this topic. So can I just kind of go through some of those?
Through those.
So although these first ones are more kind of general, but the news should be less human-centered, and there should be like an animal beat. Or it could potentially be within the environmental beat, but that doesn't, the animal research thing doesn't really fit within the environmental beat so much. So I still think that there should be journalists who focus on all the other animals on the planet. Like there is the field of animal photojournalism now from Joanne MacArthur and her We Animals Media Foundation. There is a field of animal photojournalism, not just wildlife photographers and artistic, but animal photojournalists. And then just the idea that we need to include the non-human animals' perspectives and interest in any story that is relevant to them. So again, even if they're focusing on a weight loss drug in the story, if mice are involved in that research, then their interests are at stake. And to ignore them means there's a source there who's just being clearly overlooked and dismissed. And in doing so, it's the journalist basically saying those mice are unimportant, which isn't really fair to do. And then, of course, you hear me talking about this a lot, Melody, the language. And I think all of us have had to work to change our language to stop calling other animals it.
Yes, that's true.
It was hard to do. It is hard to do because we hear it day in and day out. But journalists should refer to those individuals who are being researched on as who, and someone, not something. And they are she or he or they if we don't know their gender. So that's more accurate. And also another thing is instead of just calling somebody a lab rat, as if that's who they are, they were bred for that, that's their only purpose in life, they're nothing else. We could use language that puts a verb in there that shows that that we are doing something to them. They are a rat who is kept in captivity, or rats who are uninformed and unconsenting
or cats.
Research. Yeah, cats, rats, dogs who are researched. So it's not like a lab cat, or it's a cat. She or he is a cat who is kept in captivity in a research lab. So it's a longer way of describing them, but it's a more accurate way. And it brings in the human element because, again, it's showing they are not – I feel this way with farmed animals too. That they are not farm animals. They are farmed because we are doing that to them. They're not making the choice to kind of sacrifice themselves for our taste buds here. And then, of course, journalists should investigate animal research and breeding facilities. And there's all kinds of stories, that can come from that. And I'll just bring this up now, even though it could come up later. I don't know what's happening with that story in South Georgia where there was going to be a company that wanted to breed monkeys for research, and they wanted to, like, they picked some small rural community in Georgia, and then the community just didn't want this, rightly so. I don't know exactly, maybe it seems like it's polluting, it's just weird, maybe it seems unsafe and loud and dirty or something. And so I was happy to see that community pushing back, but this was maybe like a year or so ago. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like, or
Bainbridge.
Georgia. Bainbridge. Okay.
Yeah. And I think they're still fighting it. So
I was hoping that that the person who was trying to be the developer there would just leave and say, well, they're unwanted here. But
yeah, they're still fighting it. I mean, that's difficult because those businesses have lots and lots of money and.
Yeah, or they might use the jobs argument or something like that. Although that would be a traumatizing job for a human to deal with that. But that controversy is an opportunity then for journalists to say, what's going on with this monkey breeding that we're seeing? Just like that issue, remember this was just like a week or two ago where there was, I think, rhesus monkeys that were being taken to Tulane University, and they were from a breeding facility in Mississippi, and then there was a truck crash, and some of them, I think, died, and then some of them escaped, but then they were getting flat out murdered by the police who were just
homeowners.
And yes, right. And so I was reading the different stories on that, and honestly, I felt the coverage of that issue with the rhesus monkeys who kind of escaped that crash was so awful. Like, it was even glamorizing the people who shot the monkeys as if it was really saving their kids, as if the rhesus monkeys care about their kids. The rhesus monkeys, they're just really scared. And also there was all this false information that went out that the monkeys were like contaminated with diseases, which they actually weren't. And so they were kind of shown as aggressive, and they just kind of made them out to be the problem, when they're the victims of everything, and then we're going around shooting them, and then we're saying they're the ones that are aggressive. So it's just like the news. I mean, sometimes I saw a reporter putting the word destroyed in quotes, like, because that was, I guess, what the medical research group was saying. Oh, well, they were don't worry, they were destroyed. But that term destroyed
sanitizes it. And it was
they were
really
shot.
murdered.
They were shot because maybe they wouldn't be useful anymore for the research purposes. But so that's it opens up an opportunity for journalists to not just cover the event of what happened, but to really investigate, why are we doing this, and who's really the victim here. And I like journalists to question not just the inhumane treatment of those animals, in this case the monkeys kept in the labs, but our own entitlement to use them as unwilling, unconsenting subjects, and as you mentioned before, the effectiveness of even using them at all and putting everybody in this situation. So there's just so much more questioning that could be done proactively. And there can also be undercover footage, and it'd be great if the journalists got that undercover footage. But first and foremost, they should ask. I mean, it's usually the activists that have to get the undercover footage. Also, because if we asked to see a research lab or a breeding facility, they wouldn't let us in. But even with the journalists, a lot of times they're not let in. But I am advocating on the animalsandmedia.org that journalists should be more persistent about saying, oh, you want me to do a story related to this research? Well, I want to see your laboratory. I want to see how the individuals, the research subjects, are being treated. And I want to film and photograph them. Like, we need to see them. I don't want a generic picture of a rhesus monkey's head. Like, I want to see the actual rhesus monkey and what are the conditions they're living in, and what does their skin and their whole, what's their demeanor. And like, because that way the other animal species can speak for themselves through audiovisual media. But if the journalists don't push, and if the labs just have some kind of somewhat BS like response saying, oh, well, it's not, sanitary or something, then I say put on a hazmat suit and go in there. Like, say you're not going to do a story unless you kind of have access. But we really don't see pictures on the news unless they were taken by undercover animal activists,
Right.
we don't tend to see news. I mean, there might be some reels that were like PR, footage from the laboratory, but journalists shouldn't be just airing kind of PR footage. So there's a lot more that where the animals can speak for themselves. And then that's really kind of touching.
And I think, it's so upset. Well, there's a reason they aren't shown.
Yes,
I mean,
right.
when you think about how upset people would be, and it is still legal, by the way, here in Georgia, pound seizure. But if people were able to see that, they can go and buy cats who have been given up at a shelter and then take them to the lab and cut their brains open while they're still alive, or sew
Gross.
kittens' eyelids shut. People don't want to see that. That's horrific. And, they keep that very, very hidden from the
Yes.
public, right?
Yes.
And there is no statewide law against it in Georgia. Now, it was stopped many years ago here, with the local shelter here in
Okay.
DeKalb, because people came forward, the public came forward and spoke up. But it does happen, and it happens all over the country. And I think you're right. If journalists were able to get in there, show pictures, I think that would stop.
Yeah. And and also it's a more complete and holistic way of doing reporting.
Right.
That says,
it's balanced.
yes, that I want access and I want to show everybody who's
Mm-hmm.
involved in this and I want to see. And then that evidence can be shown to the public. And if they don't like it, the public has the opportunity to push back. But if you never show the cats or whatever, and you just kind of brush past it and just say what they're studying without us seeing some of the suffering that's involved, then people are like, oh, okay. They don't,
Yeah, it's like them going into a journalist going into a war zone and not showing the people who have been, affected by war and the suffering. That'd be like, okay, well, we're not going to show you all that. We're just going to say a lot of people suffered, and just show you some buildings.
Right. Right.
They don't do that.
We have to understand, the harsh truth of things. So,
Which motivates people, and has, I think, stopped or helped stop some wars.
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
When people
or it brings
see-
a lot of humanitarian aid also to show anybody suffering, even when it's hard to see that suffering, it'll bring more attention to it. And
to what caused it
yeah.
and the issues. And it's, no one would consider, I don't think a journalist would consider not showing a balanced or giving a balanced story on that.
Yeah.
So I think the non-human animals deserve that kind of treatment as well by
do.
journalists. Yeah.
And another thing that we say in the animalsandmedia.org guidelines, and this also comes from a paper that I wrote with Dr. Mark Beckoff and Dr. Sarah Bexell about using other animals as news sources. And those doctors who I mentioned are PhDs in science, because I was like, they're animal ethologists who study animal behavior. So let's have them help me talk to journalists about how they can do this. But we said that journalists should be able to say when they do go into a lab and then you're seeing a little baby rhesus monkey clinging even to the research worker or somebody just like all scared and desperate, the journalist should be able to interpret. They should show that with their camera and we should see it. But the journalist should also, as a member of the animal kingdom, your basic understanding of some emotions, just go ahead and acknowledge if he or she seems to be scared, or if they seem to be bored, if they seem to be in pain, if they seem to be lethargic, or like what are you seeing? And because a lot of times I will see stories, even if you see pictures, they won't say the obvious thing that you can see in the picture, that the animals are scared. And it's like, well, why aren't you saying the obvious thing? So I just like, let's give journalists permission to speak on behalf of the other animal, and we can visually see that animal and have it confirmed for ourselves. But you could also, if the journalists feel like, well, there's maybe a sophisticated level of communication from these different species, that like maybe a dog expert should come in if there's dogs in a lab. And that's okay too. Yes, bring in a dog expert to look at the behavior. Oh, his ears are kind of down. His tail is down. he's panting. That means he's stressed. Like, so if we don't feel comfortable with some of the things, you know how sometimes like you could look at a dolphin and the shape of their mouth looks like they're smiling. So we could, but you know, it's not saying we can't misinterpret, but somebody who understands dolphin behavior like Dr. Lori Marino could tell us if there's signs of distress. So yeah, bring in those experts on the species and also include advocates for those species who work at like an animal-free research foundation, some scientists who work in the alternatives to research environment, have them come in on all these stories too. Usually that is totally absent, but that's another legitimate perspective that just gets routinely overlooked.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just really unfair. So with the time we have left, let's talk a little bit more, Melody, about the just types of stories that we see. We covered some of them in terms of how like the incidents that will happen, accidents with escaped animals, that always kind of makes the news. What are some other types of stories that you see in terms of when you think of, it could be from you as an activist, like we've done a lot of stuff over the years, or I haven't done as much, but like with Emory University and their primate lab, that has been one of the touchstones or like the main area of emphasis, at least in the Atlanta area, for anti-vivisection advocates or animal rights advocates have really focused on Emory. How have you seen that reported over the years? Like what's the difference between what you think is fair reporting of activists speaking out for decades versus the times where you felt it was unfair news coverage?
Yeah, I think it has not, for the most part, it's generally not very balanced. And what I've seen over time is takes generally one of two routes. It's either, if the activists actually do something like, say, chain themselves to the front of Emory, which we've done.
Civil disobedience.
Right. So civil disobedience. Then the stories around, these people came and here's what they did. And they're speaking out against Emory because of animal research and they chain themselves and this and that. But they never really talk. They don't get into any specifics about what's actually happening there. They focus on, the sensationalism, right?
Yeah.
Or the other thing I've seen, and I remember specifically one, it was kind of a local, like Decatur type newspaper. I don't remember the name of it, but when they covered it, they mentioned that activists had been out there, and then they ended with a paragraph about how Emory's research on primates is so helpful to human and it helps advance human health. And no mention. Okay, so that is that's a perspective, not the correct one, I'll say. But there was no mention of, the other side of it. So I've not seen balanced reporting at all on that, really.
Yeah. So, I mean, activists can drive a news story and legitimate coverage, but then if the journalists don't take that up and they only focus on the spectacle and not the substance, then they're just saying, some activists that were human activists were kind of acting up out here. Like that's the story.
Right.
And not like, well, why are they so upset? I mean, we don't want to stand out on the side of the road with signs or yelling or on a Saturday morning spend our time that way. That's not really what we want to do. It's like that's how strongly people feel for speaking up for these individuals. And so I think that journalists, and this is just a protest dynamic that happens. It could be Black Lives Matter or anything. I think a lot of activist groups feel the same way. Like, let's go a little deeper here and not just focus on the protest itself, but like, why are people so upset and what are the solutions they're proposing?
I feel like, though, with human activist stories, I agree it could be better, but I at least feel like they have some context around it because they can point to, and they're here, and and this happened to this other human, and that has incensed them, or whatever.
Yeah, they have more statistics, like on police brutality or something.
Right.
Yeah.
But with the animals, they generally don't. So what activists, the best they can hope for or have hoped for in the past with journalists is that they give a website or they, pique the interest of people reading the story. So they'll go do some research. But what would be great is if they do that and give the other, give some context. Like, for instance, when Winka, the oldest living chimp that was being researched on at Emory, was still alive and there was a lot of protest. Occasionally they would mention Winka's age, being 58, but still not the full story, still not enough. So the hope was that just the mention of her age and people being out there would inspire people to go look it up. But the ideal journalist response would be giving a balanced story.
And having, and that was something else I had in the slideshow, was the opportunity to cover individuals who are researched on. Maybe they've been retired to a sanctuary, like the Project Chimps, which you recently did an excellent show on. Or there's Winka, who spent her whole life, stuck in laboratories, and now she's at Emory University. She has a narrative. She has a story.
Well, she did. Yeah, she passed away.
She passed away.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And she never was retired?
No.
That is ridiculous.
In fact, there's still chimps in labs.
Yeah.
Of course, supposedly there's no vivisection, but, many chimps died before they could ever get out of the lab, even after that legislation went through, or whatever, the Great Ape Act. But, but she never made it out.
Yeah. But I still thought that was a wonderful campaign that you and some other people were in charge of, is picking an individual instead of just saying Emory, the primate lab. Oh, let's talk about someone who's in there over 50 years, or, she's over 50 years and she's in there. Can we retire her? And that never happened, but it was a reasonable request.
Yeah. And
it makes for a great story that then, raises further questions. But I really like the story that you did a month or so ago, which I just mentioned, with the director of Project Chimps up in Blue Ridge, Georgia, so that's a great that was great reporting by you on our public affairs show, independent news here in a way, to say, oh, look at all these individuals who are finally getting a new chance at life because they're getting out of a lab and they've been retired, but now they're not going to be stuck in the lab anymore, languishing there. They are going to have more community in a sanctuary. So I do think sanctuary residents make great feature stories and really personify and give a narrative and a face to this. So the more people connect with those individuals, the more they start to question, oh, that particular guy, Nellie or Haley or whatever her name is, she went through that,
And I think that's why the Winka story, to be honest, caught on to your point, because, but they purposefully do not release information. So it's usually pretty difficult, but I do agree. I think giving the journalist an actual individual to focus on really helped. It's just not always possible. Yeah. Right.
Because sometimes we can't get enough information about who's in there. Yes, right. Exactly. There's so much lack of transparency. But that's the other thing that journalists could ask for.
They could get maybe more than the average person, right?
Yeah. Because another thing I was saying in my presentation was what's newsworthy is how to improve. And both stories about alternatives to animal research should be newsworthy, but also waste of money and waste of tax dollars going towards different types of research that's deemed particularly cruel or just really ineffective, although I like to critique all of it. But I know our movement does not want to be and is not anti-science, so it's not like we should just say with ignorance, oh, anything that some scientist is doing that I don't understand is bad research. But get people who do understand more about what's happening and could say maybe the purpose of the research is legitimate, but the process they're going through is not effective and it's not ethical. And they're spending X amount of millions or thousands of dollars and X amount of lives and time. And a lot of that money is probably public money. Of course, there's been a lot of cutbacks in the Trump administration to scientific research. So there's probably going to have to be more private money than taxpayer money, but still it's resources being put in this direction that could be funneled elsewhere for more effective and humane research. So, so that's like another thing they can do. So those were some of the main things, is just the idea that we should be challenging anthropocentric biases in the news and recognize that bias towards the status quo as a problem in news, and the attempt to be more open and diverse and to tell a fuller story includes alternatives to animal research and more acknowledgement of the individual animal species who are being sacrificed against their will. And should we as a society keep doing this to them? I mean, you and I think the answer is no. And so let's have more of a discussion of that in the news as a public forum.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for all your work and bringing all this to light and helping journalists be better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they want to do this, and I hope that their corporate overlords will be supportive of that. But I like that we're here at a non-commercial station too. So also we need to support any kind of non-commercial public media.
Like WRFG.
So thank you for listening to Second Opinion Radio and In Tune to Nature with Melody Paris and Carrie Freeman. And you can find our show information on the WRFG.org website, and we both have Facebook pages, for our shows as well. I'm ending the live portion here. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at WRFG.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. I record from Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the Muskogee Creek Territory and former range of the Red Wolf, now home to some coyote families and millions of squirrels. You can access action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, wrfg.org/intune-to-nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, and you heard me with my co-host Melody Paris, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia at wrfg.org. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species. Thank you for listening. Cheers.